Welcome to Oh God, What Now? The inflatable dinghy of truth fighting against the Tory wave machine of nonsense. I'm Alex Andreou. On today's show, the New Statesman, Keir Starmer embarks on a global schmooze fest as he sets out his vision of an improved relationship with Europe and a plan to fix the asylum system. But will the EU play ball? Plus, is the pensions triple lock a minimum protection for people who have contributed to the system and deserve dignity in old age, or an unsustainably expensive vote-buying exercise that no one dares go back on? But first, let's meet the panel. Ros Taylor is the host of Jam Tomorrow and the author of an upcoming book about trust. Hello, Ros.
Hello. Hi.
After the bit of HS2 that would link Manchester to Leeds was cancelled, and we were told it may probably not come into Euston straight away, but stop in some village outside London, now government is briefing that it might not go from Birmingham to Manchester. Why are we so bad at large infrastructure projects?
Well, I want to be contrary here and suggest that actually we're not too bad at big infrastructure projects.
Really, though?
But, we did the Channel Tunnel. How
long did that take?
This is the thing, it takes us a long time. We did Crossrail, we did HS1, we just about managed to open that in time for the Olympics. We take a long time, but we haven't absolutely screwed up a project in a major way yet. And this is why HS2, I think, is so difficult, because to cancel it now after so much wrangling and so many sunk costs. And of course, I know all about the sunk cost fallacy that says that, it's not necessarily a good idea just to go ahead with a project because a ton of money has already been spent on it. But to cancel it now would be a huge embarrassment. Even internationally, it would make us look like idiots. It would make us, broken Britain, look even more broken. Not only are our schools falling down and we have 7.7 million on the NHS waiting list and all the other problems we have, but we can't even build a railway that we've been saying we're going to build for the past 20 years. It looks really bad.
I was looking at comparable countries and the sort of the distance of high-speed track that they have and how much it costs them per mile. And we are just nowhere near.
Yeah.
HS1, by the way, I found out the other day. I had no idea what HS1 was. It's the bit from London to the Eurotunnel.
Yes, well, it's a high-speed track that means you can go to Margate really fast when you never used to, which is obviously great. And if you live in the southeast, it's made a big difference. But the problem, as you say, is it's so expensive because HS2 goes through some really, really expensive land in the Chilterns especially, which costs a bomb. And it costs a bomb to do compulsory purchase orders and all the things you have to do. And then you have people fighting against the route. And that's why it's been so expensive.
Yeah, I would suggest that the main links that we need and will need in the future for both road and rail, they're not sort of that mysterious. So the government really should be on a constant program of acquiring the land that we know we will need for those sort of arteries. Anyway, Hannah Fearn is a columnist at The Eye and other such hallowed publications. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
Some truly disturbing allegations surfaced at the end of last week about Russell Brand's behaviour. The reaction, I think, is as interesting as the story. We have not seen the mass distancing that we usually see, right? In fact, the tribe of Brand's fellow travellers has stayed pretty much intact and in support of him. And it includes all the usual suspects, the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons and the Elon Musks and the GB News presenters. What does it say about the current landscape, do you think?
Well, I found the sight of women cheering him at his gig on the night that the documentary went out and the Sunday Times published was the most shocking thing about it all. Women standing up with banners saying, "We support you," ignoring the testimony of other women, I found very hard to swallow. But I think the bigger point, you're right, is that is this the point at which those who've really stoked the culture wars pause and think, oh, what have we done here? Because it is this coming together of distrust of the media, distrust in the testimony of women, linking it to the Andrew Tate and the weird manosphere with the blue pill, red pill thing. Like, what's the truth? You're not understanding the truth about humanity and how people behave. And it's all come together in kind of one story. I think this is the first time I've seen one story that really brings all of those elements of the chaos that is online life at the moment in one place, and it has real world implications. These are young women's lives. Those 4 women who were brave enough to come out and share their testimony. This real people's trauma that is being raked over. So it's not just online batshittery either. As you said, this is mainstream journalists often who are stoking this. That's definitely 2. I won't name names because it's not just 2, but I saw 2 very prominent female journalists basically tweeting their support for Brand and then admitting they hadn't actually read the full extent of the allegations and the 4-year investigation by the Sunday Times.
Well, one said she hadn't even read the article.
Yeah, absolutely. They hadn't read it. But they were just nevertheless coming out.
They were in his corner, and in his corner they would remain.
So where does this leave us? You know, you can do 4 years of extensive work into a deeply troubling, difficult story with all the legal requirements behind that, and then other journalists who work in the mainstream media will commentate on it without even reading it and undermine it. So,
and the Daily Mail will claim it as an exclusive, which was another truly bizarre thing, that they took his response to the story he knew was coming out
and this is all
splashed it across 2 pages before the Times,
I mean, that stuff happens all the time.
claiming this is our exclusive.
Brand allowed that to happen, of course, by trying to get ahead of the story, which is a classic PR tactic. But I guess my question about it all, if to step back from those women's testimony to a bigger picture, is where does it leave us? That we are now in this situation where you almost can't address any personal issue or an individual's claims without it becoming part of this culture war, this toxic debate between them and us.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is the similarities with Trump.
Yeah.
And, also a sexual predator.
Yeah.
Also very well-sourced accusations made against him, which have not touched him at all. And that is because he has built up this personality cult in the same way that Russell Brand has. Because Russell Brand occupies a space in public life which we can't really define very well now. He's not a politician. He was a comedian, a general entertainer, a presenter. Now he's not really that anymore. Now he has enormous social media influence, and he has a following, and he has this kind of libertarian, woo, vaccine skeptic, basically QAnon adjacent persona.
Yeah, the crankosphere.
Yeah, but what do you call someone like that? You haven't even got a name for what he is now.
I've got a name for what he is, but Andrew doesn't like it when we say that word. Do you think this was by coincidence? Because I have heard some people suggest that people join the crankosphere and become advocates for it in anticipation of stories like that coming out, because they know it future-proofs their income.
I saw this mooted as well. And it's interesting that there is a correlation in the timing between him developing this sudden urgency and building his own personal community online, and the other things going on where he knows Me Too is happening, so there's that question mark.
And those 2 investigations have been going on for years.
Absolutely.
So he would have known something about it.
But I don't know if it's that straightforward, because the kind of environment that we're in has fostered that kind of reaction in people like him anyway. These narcissistic tendencies that he has, this obsession with power, influence, having all of that available to him online, and probably witnessing how other influencers have gathered those communities, and that kind of power online has just attracted him to it. And also he's part of that. I've heard him talk before about his power in drug recovery. That's all about community too. So it very much taps into the sort of behaviour he was already invested in. But it is convenient.
I mean, I have to say, sometimes these stories come as a complete surprise, and this one did not, at least to me. Not that that means anything, but
you have to,
just saying.
You have to, unfortunately, acknowledge, but this is a man with a great deal of charisma. Now, he doesn't do it for me, but he certainly does it for a lot of people. They make him feel good. He makes them feel good about themselves. And he has managed to do that. And you can see that as a pattern pretty much throughout his career that he's decided to exploit because, as you say, influencer is probably the best word for him now.
He's an influencer in the real sense of the word, I think, rather than the sort of social media.
Buying power,
And we see this pattern with with men who are charismatic. We saw it with Johnson, we see it with Trump, and we see that
Corbyn, actually.
Well,
also not that he courted it, but all I'm saying is his supporters have that same sort of fervour that anything negative said about him must be untrue and part of some conspiracy to get him, rather than have any merit.
But sometimes, as in the case of Brand and Trump, it goes with sexual predation as well.
Yeah.
And it's something that, frankly, we've seen throughout history. And he is just the latest example.
Now, before we get into the topics proper, I'm going to break tradition, because we simply have to devote a few minutes to Liz Truss making a speech to the Institute of Government and the Q&A that followed that. As a famous lettuce once said, je vinaigrette rien. Hannah, what are the main takeaways of this glorious rebranding?
Well, it's not really a rebranding, is it? So they're standing up and saying the same thing over again, hoping you'll get a different result. Isn't that the definition of madness?
Yeah.
This is a perversion of. The thing I found most fascinating about the whole spectacle was that she'd had a year to prepare for this. The whole point was that it's the anniversary of her creating her government and so on. And she managed, with a year's preparation, to stuff it so remarkably. She stumbled over a lot of the important lines and the detail and the data. And the only sort of new line in there, as it were, in terms of her saying, this is what I could have done, but you didn't give me the time, was there was this commitment to a restraint on government spending, which she said would have accompanied the mini budget, but we didn't get to hear that part of the package. But everything else was really a complete reiteration of everything we'd already heard.
Because the dinner parties got her, apparently. I mean...
Well, there aren't any dinner parties, Liz, because we're all too skint to hold them. So I'd like to tell you, I promise you this is not the topic of conversation, because we're not getting...
I know you say it's a year since that happened, but that to me is very quickly to try and make a sort of rehabilitative comeback into public life. What is the pressing need? I mean, she could have left it like 3 or 4 years and it might have gone down a little bit better. Is it possible that she thinks she can have another crack at the leadership?
I think
is it to undermine Sunak further?
I don't think it's actually about having another crack at leadership. Oh, not least because if she wanted that, she's demonstrated that she's absolutely not the person. That she has absolutely no leadership qualities whatsoever, no charisma, no style, no ability to convince and enchant, all of those things, weirdly, that we were just talking about a moment ago. But I think, are we sure that it was unsuccessful in the way that she wants? We are obviously all raising an eyebrow at it. But there's a hardcore of the Conservative Party, and still in the Parliamentary Party, even though she's stuck a stick into the Parliamentary Party as well, who would give her another go. And she knows that. And there were elements in there that I thought were quite clever in her speech, talking about people who are earning $50,000 but are claiming universal credit. That is actually possible if you're a single parent to about 6 children and living in an extremely expensive private rented home. It's a really rare occurrence, but she's managed to find some data that really draws on those kind of heartstrings. And also talking about the fates of millionaires, she shows that I think she knows that there are a few people who haven't given up on her version of history. So I don't think it's actually about another immediate leadership attempt. It's about saying, I still think I was right. And for those of you who also think I was right, I'm here, you're here. Let's not wither away.
In the audience, of course, was Nigel Farage, apparently, Patrick Minford, Julian Jessup, etc., etc. And no one once saw their lips move. Ros, what struck you most?
What struck me most was that she seemed to exist in a world where low growth is the only problem afflicting Britain right now. Where, our growth is rubbish at the moment, our GDP is rubbish, but this is not the only problem that Britain has. There were no answers at all to the fact that public services are so run down. Somebody asked her about the NHS and the long waiting lists and what she would do about that, and she said, the problem is all management. I don't think the NHS needs more money. It's all poor management, which is, your standard reply that comes from right-wingers about the NHS. But the notion that long waiting lists don't affect people's ability to work and don't affect the rest of the economy, and that the running down of public services in this country doesn't make it harder for Britain to grow, was something that entirely it just exists outside her worldview.
Mm-hmm. And she was challenged a few times directly to apologise to people whose mortgages were affected. And I found that to be quite extraordinary. She just refused.
She said interest rates will go up anyway.
They were going up anyway.
Yeah, I just happened to be around at the time.
The section on housing.
They just went up in 1 week, all in one go. So what's the problem? It reminded me of, I think, something Keane said, that the problem with just looking at the long term is that in the long term we're all dead.
She had a go at the mainstream media over that. She basically said the mainstream media had put across the narrative that she had done
sort of
that.
went, J'accuse, it's you that reported it wrong.
That whole section on housing really flipped my lid, to be honest, because she basically blamed failures of the left, which is remarkable because what we've seen is entirely failures of the right. The housing sector, development sector, property developers are not building because it's uneconomic to do so right now.
Is this a nightmare for number 10, Ros? Truss reminding everyone of a period they would much rather the nation forgot? Or is it actually quite useful as it makes Sunak appear competent and sensible by comparison?
I think he might think that. And to a certain extent, I can understand why. It certainly makes him seem extremely competent in comparison. It reminds everyone what a shit show the Truss premiership was. But I think to most people in Britain, it's all of a piece. It's all of a piece with Tory, with the succession of prime ministers and the hellscape that was last autumn politically. And it all goes together and creates an impression of, they're all part of the same problem. On the other hand, as well, as Hannah says, there are some people in the Conservative Party who very much want to hear her message and are very keen to hear about the possibility of tax cuts, because we're not hearing it anywhere else. No one, fairly sensible is talking about tax cuts being a reasonable possibility at the moment. And keeping that flame alive perhaps might feed them just a little bit and keep them on board, and it might potentially stop some kind of splinter group if the Tories do if the Tories do lose the next election. So it perhaps might serve a purpose of trying to keep those guys in the tent pissing out rather than outside the tent pissing in.
First this week, politicians have been flocking to the largest gathering of centrist dads since the debut of Robert Peston and Ed Balls' band, actually called Centrist Dad, and I didn't make any of that up. As well as Justin Trudeau, Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, Norway's Premier Jonas Gahr Støre, Finland's former PM Sanna Marin, former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney and former New Zealand leader Jacinda Ardern attended the Global Progress Action Summit. Some interesting lines have emerged, including much more daring language about fixing the current UK-EU deal, and a more fleshed-out plan about asylum seekers, the backlog of decisions, and small boat crossings. Ros, the FT on Monday splashed with Labour government would seek to rewrite the Brexit deal. What does that mean exactly? Is that an accurate assessment of what was said?
It means that Keir Starmer feels able to creep a little closer to the European Union without being savaged by the right-wing press in this country. Basically, the Brexit deal, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is due for review in 2025. Now, review, as far as the EU is concerned, is a fairly limited word. It just means, how is it functioning? If it's not functioning very well, can we make it function a bit better? It doesn't, I think, for the EU mean opening it up and rewriting it. However, I think Keir Starmer sees certain opportunities to improve the state of relations between Britain and the EU, to remove some of the trade frictions. And let's bear in mind that quite a few of the trade frictions that we will see haven't even happened yet, because they keep being pushed into the future because they're going to be so difficult when they happen. Perhaps we could see some action on mobility and, the difficulty of people even going on a business trip to some parts of the EU now and vice versa. And then the phytosanitary regulations, which I won't get into, but which we occasionally chat about on this podcast. What it doesn't mean, of course, as far as Starmer is concerned, is the single market, is the customs union, is, God forbid, rejoining the EU. It means tinkering around the edges.
Like you say, EU sources have been quite hostile to the idea that this might become a full-on renegotiation, and emphasise that what is written into the TCA is an implementation review. You sort of look at how it's working and tweak bits that don't work so well. I mean, my argument would be that that's quite extensive at the moment. But why does Labour think it can improve terms? Does it genuinely think it can improve terms, or is it just puff?
I think it does, and I think it wants to nurture a less hostile environment, you could say, towards the EU. Now, clearly, this was more of an issue under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, when clearly we, were slacking off the EU at every opportunity. But he thinks that if he can reset relations further, and of course we've already made some progress with Horizon and Frontex, and build trust with the EU, that there will be more of an openness to doing deals around the edges on these things, that I mentioned earlier, border checks and even things like carbon pricing, for example. At the moment, it's very complex, but we are basically undermining the EU's efforts to set a carbon price by undercutting them in Britain, which is unhelpful, to say the least, but gets very little publicity. Energy, cooperation on things like that. Defence, so it's not an EU competence really, is something else that we can work with. The VAT rules, which are going to make life very difficult for quite a few people. That sort of thing. But I think what he wants is he would like to see as a cultural change in our attitudes to the EU, to take the toxicity out of that relationship, and for the EU to feel that they are people we can talk to and we can trust. For the EU to feel that we are people that they can talk to and whom they can trust. And that would be a bit of a step change. And, this is a beginning. And of course, now he's not talking about rejoining the single market. It is still politically deemed too toxic to do so. I doubt that can happen in the next decade. But he probably wouldn't be Prime Minister in a decade. And a lot of things can change. It's a question of putting the relationship on a better footing. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's interesting that as you were listing all that stuff, what struck me was that quite a lot of it can be done unilaterally. Like you could just announce your intention to stay in alignment with employment regulations. It doesn't have to be an agreement, right?
Dynamic
it doesn't
alignment.
have to be exactly.
Yeah.
You could put the whole of the UK in the same phytosanitary zone as Northern Ireland, which would solve loads of those problems. You can do that unilaterally. You don't have to agree it with anyone. Hannah, Naomi's never far from our hearts. Best for Britain have produced a report on the number of EU artists that have performed at UK festivals since Brexit. And we also saw the Independent Society of Musicians publish a report last week on the catastrophic effect of Brexit the other way around, UK artists working in Europe. Is this the sort of thing that can be improved on the margin?
Yeah, just as Ros was saying, really, I think there's that kind of sector by sector agreements or alignments that you can manage that just make life easier for everyone and probably don't cause the same amount of uproar that you would otherwise see. I mean, we've recently seen the very, very welcome rejoining of the Horizon membership, which is the European Scientific Research Group that we kind of fell out of as part of the Brexit process. And now we've managed to very quietly find a way to rejoin because everybody sensible has realised it's a disaster to not be part of that.
I mean, including Sunak, to his credit. He's done quite a lot of that stuff. He's pretty much gone through the list of Labour's sort of asks from last year and done 70% of them in terms of what needs improving.
Labour is being very pragmatic, exactly as you said, Ros, that you can't scrap Brexit now. It's at least 10 years, I suspect probably longer away, but you can make it better. And these kind of compromises can be found almost everywhere, I think. And if you're under a Labour government, you haven't got the difficulty that Sunak has of having to manage his own party. Most people within Labour, the vast majority within Labour, you've only got a few rogue backbenchers.
We'll be pushing the other way, actually. Yeah,
exactly. So it seems a great example. I think Horizon was so welcomed, not only because it felt like the right thing to do and Sunak had accepted it, but also because it felt like that a moment of compromise had finally been reached. And it is a starting point for every other compromise that will need to be made to...
Galileo, Erasmus, Frontex. I mean, there's a whole series of them. It seems to me that what is more important here is the language. Starmer talking directly about Brexit, which he absolutely refused to do a year ago, talking about it in terms of improving the future of his daughter and his son. Is this a blip, do you think, or is it actually a course correction?
I'm not sure if it's either. It's definitely not a blip. It's clever
planned.
language. It's clever language that sort of almost both sides of the argument. It speaks very directly, both to young people, because he talks about his son and daughter, but also he's addressing, I think, the regrets and frustrations of people who did vote for Brexit but didn't vote for this because they didn't know what they were voting for and they didn't expect the lunatics to take over the asylum and absolutely destroy it. So that language is very important on that. He seems to have thought very sensitively about how you make amendments to a hard Brexit palatable and has hit upon something. Yeah. And I think it works quite well. And, arguably you could say that this is the sort of the first step to rejoin. If you want to believe that, go ahead, because it feels good to hope that.
Well, rejoin depends on the other side as well, as I always have to point out.
Again, I think it's quite clever because it allows some people to sort of gain that hope in their heart while also not really meaning that. Yeah. So it's a bit of a choose your own adventure response.
Ros, politicians love a list. Starmer identified 4 major global problems: climate change, people smuggling, terrorism and weakening democracy. Has he got his priorities right, do you think?
It's not a bad list. I mean, you can't disagree with climate change. People smuggling, I suspect he actually means migration in general and the challenges of all kinds of irregular migration, whether it's driven by climate change or war or all the other things that are driving it. Terrorism, it's always going to be a threat. I would say disease was a bigger threat, as we saw during the pandemic, and the effect that can have on international relations is huge, and it will be, if we do get a pandemic that is more deadly than COVID-19 was, I think that is something that the international community barely dares to think about. But he doesn't mention weakening democracy. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, populism he could have said, but he probably wouldn't, because weakening democracy sounds a little more diplomatic. Yeah, there's also nuclear proliferation. I think that is worth a nod. It's been going on for a long time, but it's still as acute as ever.
I mean, can I just make the general point that just this kind of global summit to which journalists go and the lines that are coming out, broadly speaking, instead of being Trump declares war on Andorra or, Boris Johnson seen naked in Fountain, The lines coming out are all very professional. We're going to all work together and be sensible and do stuff. It's a massive relief, right? One of Starmer's lines on immigration at this conference was that border security, and I quote, is a progressive cause. Soft borders benefit no one except smuggling gangs and those who want to whip up distrust and hatred. Is this window dressing for a harsher approach, or does he have a point?
This is realpolitik. I think borders have become and are going to become much more important in Europe. I am not sure that Schengen, as it exists today, will continue to exist in the future. I'm not sure that freedom of movement, as it exists in the EU today, will continue, because there are increasing numbers of pressures making people want to close borders more often, whether that is COVID, whether that is natural disasters with the flows of people as a result, whether it is wars on the border with Ukraine and so on. And that is going to reaffirm people's the importance people attach to borders, and it is going to be very hard for the EU to stand up against that. If you were being a little bit cynical, you could say that represented something of an opportunity for Starmer. For example, is it possible to be in the single market without freedom of movement? Well, if the EU no longer has freedom of movement, then yes, it is. But that is projecting really into the future, and I know a lot of people may disagree with me, but it is my feeling that that the borders are going to be to tighten immensely, partly because it's easier to tighten them than it has been in the past, and the countries are more serious about their ability to keep people out, and it is more obvious to people when borders are being breached in a way that used to be fairly less
satellite
visible.
imaging, unmanned vehicles.
Nigel Farage on a beach in Kent. Yes.
That is the main deterrent. It would be to me, if I knew that I was heading for a beach where Nigel Farage was standing, I would change course. Hannah, much of the reporting has been along the lines, he will let 100,000 more migrants in. And media seems to acknowledge that this number is a complete fiction. I saw that live, I think on Sky News, it was on Sunday morning. Someone said, this number has been plucked out of the air and has no relation to reality, but let's talk about it anyway. So they then still interrogate Labour and its basis. Is such open fabrication of data, do you think, a sign of panic at Conservative headquarters, or is it a cool, considered, calculated strategy to use this kind of disinformation in the coming election?
It's back to Ian Dunt's round numbers, isn't it? Like there's all of those numbers are fabricated. Anything with a zero on the end is fabricated. And it provides a talking point. So I don't think it's necessarily panic. I think it's about trying to control a narrative. They know that a figure with a round number helps to control a narrative. It's something people can latch on to. But actually...
Yeah, but this one is completely made up.
Yeah, but they all are. And to be fair, I think that Labour saying that it needs specifically 1,000 caseworkers to manage the migration backlog is also an entirely plucked out of thin air number. And it's done for the same reason. I mean, they'll claim there's some calculations on there, but 1,000 specifically. So I think the number simply is a way of trying to attract attention and hold attention. I don't think it's necessarily panic. It's just understanding how people receive news information.
Yeah, I'm going to push back against that, I'm afraid, because I think if you do some work and someone says, so we've calculated that you need 982 new caseworkers to proceed at that rate. Rounding it to 1,000 seems sensible, but this figure that the Conservatives are talking about is not some rounded figure. It's a completely invented figure. They've looked at the allocation deal that EU member states have with each other at the moment and extrapolated that if the UK entered in those terms and immigration into the EU increased by the current trend, you would end up with 100,000.
It is absolutely about trying to control the narrative and nothing more. It's not, as you say, it's not about
It's not controlling it's making shit up.
Yeah, to try and get people to listen to them.
But
yeah,
why
I don't agree
are we
with it.
beautifying it by going, they're controlling the narrative? They're making shit up.
I honestly don't believe that Labour are immune to this, and I think that we could go through almost everything that Starmer has said in the last
Why
few
are we
weeks
two siding this? I'm asking you about this number, this 100,000 migrants that was splashed on the front of 3 newspapers last weekend, and you're talking about Labour hiring more asylum processors.
I don't think. I'm surprised you're so surprised. Is what I'm saying. I'm surprised you're so surprised that they are doing this.
Yeah,
it's horrible. But it's not a surprise.
I guess I'm surprised because this one is entirely made up, and I'm surprised because that usually is not acknowledged. But in this case, it has been acknowledged. Like, if you read even the Telegraph's report of this figure, it goes, it's a bit
shaky.
It's quite dodgy, really, how they've arrived at that and still splash that headline.
And all of the government's communications about migration over the last 3 years has just been utterly fabricated. Yeah. And because they are essentially, in my view, and I'm sure everyone around this table agrees, doing something utterly immoral in the way they handle migration. So they're simply plucking figures out of the air to try and to manage it. And when I say they're trying to wrest control, what I mean is they've done something that I think is actually, they've gone by their same playbook. Let's pick a scary figure out of the thin air. But it's a strange choice because if you're not listening properly to the radio on this one, it actually sounds a little bit like that's how many they've let slip through already. Yes, they've it's almost an own goal because what people are hearing is 100,000 migrants coming into this country, and we've currently still got a Tory government.
And the curious...
So I think it's a very poor strategy, as well as it being an attempt to use the same old playbook.
The curious thing as well was that they chose to illustrate it with a backdrop of migrants arriving on a Kent beach. And so you have this figure with, the situation which the Conservatives have, got themselves into, and reinforcing the message that people are arriving illegally in the UK in their hundreds, or sometimes thousands every week. Yeah. And to do that was very odd, a very strange decision.
Ros, just to round this off, Starmer is meeting Macron. Today, Tuesday, when you're listening to this. Is there a sense that the world is beginning to treat Starmer a little bit as already the Prime Minister? But is there an electoral danger in that, considering the fact that, one of the things that animated Brexit was a generalised fear of this global elite?
No, I don't think it's too much of a risk to him. I mean, you've got to bear in mind the Montreal conference that he's just been to, full of the centrist dads, as you put it. Actually, a lot of the global leaders there were no longer in power. Tony Blair, Sanna Marin in Finland.
Jacinda Ardern.
Yes, Jacinda Ardern. It wasn't, actually, it wasn't, and it wasn't anything like Davos. It was, clearly a centre-left gathering as well.
It was a little fantasy football, wasn't it? It's like, here's what you could have won if you didn't vote like a fuckwit.
And also, the contrast as well is pretty strong with Jeremy Corbyn. I think it makes Starmer look like the kind of guy who could talk to other powerful people on the world stage and look as though he fits in. And whatever your views on Corbyn, he never quite looked like he fitted in that kind of environment, whereas Starmer does, and that is an electoral advantage. Apparently, he just let slip as well casually that he talks to Obama a lot. Which I thought was masterful.
What worse people to have on your speed dial? Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Who should be the target of our probation and who should be the subject of probation? Who deserves a fuss and who deserves Liz Truss? Hannah.
Okay, so my heroes of the week, for very, very obvious reasons, are the comics Catherine Ryan and Sarah Pascoe, who are two women who have spoken as openly as libel law and every other legal restriction upon us allowed them about the Me Too situation in their own industry, and they're allies for women everywhere and generally hilarious. And so good for them, and thank you for being there. Hurrah. My villain of the week is everybody, from the politicians down to the keyboard warriors, moaning about the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit coming in Wales. So they've made it sound like the entire country of Wales is going to have a 20-mile-an-hour speed that you can't possibly travel from like Prestatyn to somewhere without going at 20 miles an hour. Obviously, that's nonsense. The policy is it's just that in towns and villages, built up busy areas
where there is a
where there's high protest, where there's already a
yeah.
30-mile-an-hour speed limit, just bring it down to 20, because we know that if you hit someone or a child, particularly at 20, they're very unlikely to die, and if you hit them at 30, they'll be seriously injured or potentially die. Very good policy, already in place in a lot of British towns and cities, almost all of London, but Wales Twitter, and also obviously everybody involved with the low traffic neighbourhood anger is really tapping in.
I don't know, Hannah.
I have to say,
not running over children
nuts.
sounds a bit woke to me.
Exactly.
How about you, Ros?
Well, my hero is someone who I wouldn't normally perhaps nominate as a hero. Dehenna Davison, who was the Levelling Up Minister until today, the 30-year-old Tory MP.
Stuff,
yeah, because she stood down because her chronic migraine is making it impossible, she says, for her to continue to work in the role. And I really feel for her, because chronic migraine is the worst. I've suffered from it a lot. It is terrible. It does things to you that people who don't have migraine can't even imagine. And I just feel for her that, in the prime, she's really getting underway, albeit for a government that I don't like at all. She has been struck down in this way. So praise to her for being honest about it.
Yeah.
And being frank. My villain is, I'm afraid it's a bit predictable. It's Elon Musk, who's been just talking the most utter crap again. Yesterday, he said the Soros Foundation wants nothing less than the destruction of Western civilization.
Oh, for God's sake.
I mean, I declare an interest.
Was it before or after he expressed his full-throated support for Russell Brand?
I'm not sure, but I declare an interest in that. I do freelance work for Open Society foundations, but the destruction of Western civilization, the guy has just turned into. He was a troll before, but now he is more of a troll than he ever was. It's like owning Twitter has turned him into the biggest troll you can imagine. He has totally taken on the absolute worst aspects of Twitter and now personifies them.
Right, okay, so my decision is the women who have spoken out, including currently active working comedians, but also the victims who are coming forward. There are heroes of the week, and Elon Musk is our villain of the week. In a tip to other panellists, if they're listening, anytime you suggest Elon Musk, he will be the villain of the week. Now, perhaps you're a younger person, unsure if you'll ever get to pension age before the planet evaporates. Perhaps you wonder whether there will be such a thing as pensions, or just a sweet civil ceremony as you're taken away to a factory to be turned into cat treats. So, for the uninitiated, the triple lock is a coalition government concept that says pensions must increase by a figure of 2.5%, inflation, or average wage growth, whichever is highest. It's designed to protect the dignity and living standards of older people. The figure should be 8.5% this year, because that is current wage growth, including bonuses. But Work and Pension Secretary Mel Stride set a few hairs running when he failed to commit to that figure on the basis of the calculation. Not doing so could save the government billions of pounds. Hannah, is this the first time since its inception that the rules of the triple lock have looked very shaky?
It's the first time where the figures are so stark that it feels deeply unfair. However, depending on your perspective or perhaps your age, they've looked quite shaky for a long time. And the IFS actually first called for it to be scrapped back in 2015, because even back then it was very clear that once you add other elements of life other than income into it, like housing costs, employment opportunities, the gig economy, things like that began to be a big issue in around 2015. It was based on very old-fashioned assumptions that no longer were relevant. And we had this long period of low inflation, very low inflation, and almost stagnant wage growth. But in that period, pensioners were getting comparatively wealthier all the time. Now, when it was first introduced by the coalition government, and actually, let's go back, but the predecessors to it, there were some policies akin to it, but not quite as strong as the triple lock under Labour. There was a massive problem with pensioner poverty in this country.
Yeah, because before that, there was a huge period of where they really weren't.
Absolutely.
The pensioners were becoming poorer and poorer and
That's
poorer.
right. And Labour actually managed to really tackle that. And then when the coalition government came in, to be fair, when this was introduced, it was about protecting what they'd gained, that now we had a pensioner population who were not living in poverty. They were, living like the rest of us, pretty much akin, and that was right. And it was supposed to protect it. But we've now got this situation where it's completely irrelevant. So it solved a problem, and then it created a new one. And, pretty much everyone over 40, under 45, I'll say that again. Pretty much everyone under 45 knew, but even in 2015, that they were never going to get a triple locked pension. So it feels a little bit like when these numbers were created, they looked okay, but then they started to create this resentment and played into this kind of intergenerational crisis, which is very unhelpful for the country and does need to be unpicked. So I think it's right that it's being looked at very seriously.
But would Rishi Sunak seriously risk a sort of Theresa May dementia tax style policy disaster among their natural voters to try and claw back whom?
So my hunch...
younger people who don't vote for them anyway.
No. So my hunch on that, based on zero intelligence, just assumptions based on everything that we know about how the policy operates and the party, is no. I suspect he'll stick with it for the manifesto, but claim that this year is some kind of unique quirk because of the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and so on, and maybe waive it for 1 year, but still commit to it in the manifesto.
Right.
But I do think it started a conversation that means it won't be with us for much longer.
So we'll pay you that, provided it's not very high.
Yeah,
is the message. Ros, most people no longer work for a single company or even in a single career. By the time they're 40, they're likely to have paid into a number of pots with little idea how much is in each. I mean, even I don't exactly know. Does the concept of pensions in general just need standardising, tidying up somehow?
Well, there was a move towards this when they brought in the pension scheme called Nest, which private companies can use, basically smaller ones, to offer a pension scheme to their employees. And they brought that in when they brought in auto-enroll, which obviously means that you are encouraged you are nudged to be in a pension scheme as opposed to actively having to join one. And... the thing is that a lot of companies don't use Nest, and it's actually surprisingly difficult to consolidate your pensions. When you actually start looking into it, lots of them saying, oh no, you can't take your money out, or you can't put any more money from anywhere else into ours either. And I think as well, many people prefer to spread them out, especially since the financial crisis. Personally, I have a strong tendency to want to spread the risk that is inherent in a pension, to be honest, especially since the financial crisis. I get a bit paranoid about a Northern Rock-like situation, and I'm not confident in the ability of the government to bail me out should an extremely large pension scheme go bust. So what it comes down to is the relationship between the state pension and private pensions. And in other countries, that can be very different. France, of course, has a bigger, it's more state regulated. There's more state and less private element. Then that leads to other interesting questions, which might be opened up in the same way that the triple lock is opened up. For example, should people who have a very generous company pension, and some people do, be entitled to a state pension at all? Or should it be means tested effectively? Yeah. Should you not get one if you already have loads of Wonga? Well, I think that would be fair enough. After all, they did that with child benefit.
I mean, the problem you hit with that is that means testing is really quite administratively cumbersome and actually costs a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, there is that.
And also when you take the idea of
some would suggest
universalism.
that taxing, that actually applying a normal sort of tax rate to pension contributions so that if you tip over a particular thing you still pay tax might be an easier way of doing it.
Yeah.
I was just looking up some figures because there are now roughly 1 in 5 people in the UK don't have a pension, don't make a pension contribution at all, because there's so many people in the gig economy and just doing bits and bobs, working for themselves, that just don't contribute anything. And what's that going to come to?
Well, those people obviously be entirely dependent on the state pension when it comes down to it, and that is one of the failures of pension policy, that we haven't managed to set up a better scheme for people who are self-employed, and scheme for these, and encourage them to pay into.
Hannah, debates like this, I think, mask the vast inequalities between pensioners.
Absolutely.
The majority of the increase in pension income in the last 20 years down to generous defined benefit schemes, which are largely closed to new entrants. They really don't exist anymore. The state pension accounts for 40% of the income of the average pensioner, but 73% of the incomes of the poorest pensioners. Do we need to restart a debate on means testing, like Ros was suggesting? Look at taxation, do something basically to try and level that field?
Yes, I think it'll be a range of things. There probably needs to be some kind of means testing, but it has to be done carefully. I personally think the concept of a universal state pension for what you've contributed through your working life, you put in years of national insurance contributions, there's a solid, clear benefit at the end in your retirement years, is actually quite an important principle. But as you've said, it does mask these huge differences between those who have more and those who don't. A really important part of our retirement situation at the moment, is, no one will be surprised to hear me talking about this, is the housing situation. So you have a lot of pensioners who are entirely own their own home.
You really are a hammer.
I know, I'm obsessed.
And everything's a nail.
But this is very important, because we now have a generation of people my age and sort of 15 years younger who are likely to never own, a huge number of people. And the state is not used to paying vast sums of housing benefit well into retirement, and it will have to. So that's a huge part of pension and retirement planning now for the state, is that you've got to assume that you're going to be subsidising people in private rent for a huge amount of time, which has not happened before. So that's got to be part of the discussion as well.
They've got to get their skates on the social housing front, I think, because there is this whole generation coming through that you just can't be on a pension and be renting. I mean, it's completely impossible, right?
Very likely that it won't be fast enough that will happen, and there will be, I hope that we'll get social housing sorted out, but there will be a chunk of people who will still be in private rent.
Ros, several people have pointed out, the Times, Tom Carver, tweeted some data on this, that millennials agitating against the triple lock is not a smart thing, because they're undermining their own pension. Is that a fair criticism? Do we need to think a little bit longer term?
Well, it's certainly something to bear in mind, but if you really believe this system is forever, or even for the next 30 years, sure. But I think what we have seen with public policy is that it can change very rapidly, and situations can change very rapidly. And given that the pension age has already risen to 68, with extraordinarily little public debate in this country about it, that seems to me a strange hill to die on. It seems to me even sometimes it's done a little bit in bad faith, where got to think about your future. Yeah, but as Hannah's pointed out, a majority of pensioners now do own their own property, something which is increasingly denied to people under 40 and under 45. And so to say, well, you've just got to carry on waiting and be patient, seems frankly unrealistic.
Labour has been unable to commit to it either, on the basis that if the government have scrapped it by the time they get to power, they would need to completely rejig public finances to accommodate it. I mean, I think that's quite a reasonable thing to say, but it is a position that gets them in trouble time after time. On HS2, we discussed it again, because they just look mean and they look dishonest and mealy-mouthed and not really committing to anything. Is there a more elegant way of getting out of those questions, of saying, I can't tell you until we know?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, the way is simply just not to be pinned down. And you can say that you are committed, because you're the Labour Party, to ensuring pensioners get a fair deal and don't suffer in their old age. And that is hugely important. But the way to do that is going to change as economic circumstances change. And we all know that as they change, that you have to adapt. And I think it's about building trust in the Labour Party's ability to keep its promises and do the decent thing in that way, and not constantly trying to, grind them down and say, oh, you promised this, but you've taken it away. It's about, and that's part of what building trust in a political party and in a political party leader is about. Yes. You have to allow you have to grant them that kind of flex and say, yeah, we trust you to do the right thing in this circumstance, and not just constantly barrel down on the details.
As you were saying that, I could see the next day's Daily Mail cover going,
I thought the same.
Pensioners to sit in their own poop forever, says Starmer.
We know the Mail operates in bad faith. If you have a party that can inspire sufficient trust and faith in itself to do these things, then I think you can do that, and people will say, yeah, I do trust them to do the right thing. It's the Labour Party. I know what their priorities are.
I mean, you both have kids. Do they? I mean, your kids are very little.
My 2-year-old can't actually count to 10 reliably.
Ros, do your kids have an understanding of how working life leading into retirement works?
You're joking, right?
And you, Hannah, do you have any realistic expectation that your children might actually live through a model that sees them work for X amount of time and then retire?
No, but to be clear, Alex, I don't think I'm going to be able to retire. This isn't about my children.
I know, but
I have a small pension, but it will if I can't save another penny after today, which hopefully I will, it's literally give me about £1,000 a year on top of the state pension, and I'm 41 already. I fully
do you want to retire? Because I can't really see myself retiring at all.
I know what you mean, and we're very lucky that we're in an industry where,
it's not physical labor.
No, it's not physical, and presuming my mind is well enough, I hope I'd be able to continue to work as much or as little as I wanted into, 70.
I have bad news, love.
Here's the thing.
You're already losing it.
Here's the thing, right? You can't rely on your health. I've seen this with my family time and time again. And so I'm very aware that, bluntly, and I don't mind being honest about this because I believe that many listeners will be in the same position, and I'm not embarrassed. It's just the generation that we're in. And my husband is 10 years older than me, much closer to retirement, and also deeply unprepared. It's taken us this long to buy a family home to bring our children up, and we only bought it last year. We were living in a small flat before then. We haven't been able to plan for retirement until we had a house. Now we have a house. Now we're thinking about retirement planning, but it's very late. And we both work in the media, so we could hopefully both work as we get older, little bits here and there. But we can't be sure we'll be well enough. And I do worry about it. And so this is a very live issue for people in their 20s, 30s and even 40s. It's not just about our children. And I don't trust that the government, and I don't mean any particular party, that government finances will be in a position to give me very much at all when I'm in my 70s. No.
How about you, Ros? How about your kids?
Yeah, well, my kids, no, I mean, pensions are not for some reason taught in schools. I don't really understand why. It doesn't seem to be part of the citizenship curriculum, which it really
why
should be.
Give them false hope, I think.
But I mean, I think their instinct is like a lot of people to look at what their parents have and hope that will give them security. And fortunately, I own our home with my husband, and I'm incredibly lucky to do that. And I constantly feel lucky to have that, particularly as my health hasn't been great recently, and I don't know how long whether I'll be able to work until 67 as the state demands of me. But this is what happens when you feel you can't trust the state. You hoard and you think, what have my parents got? Will I be okay? How much will I inherit? Yeah. And it's why inheritance tax is disliked even by those people who won't pay it, because they feel, it's yet another taking stuff away, and you're not doing anything for me anyway. You won't give me the basics, and then when I want to pass on money to my kids, you're taking some of that away from me. And it's this I think that is something that the current government simply does not understand. And it's very hard preparing kids for what was like to be an age of upheaval and uncertainty. You don't know what you're really preparing them for, especially when their last experience of crisis, COVID, was of isolation and powerlessness. And you think, what is going to be coming down the road for my kids? I have no idea at all.
Flexibility, I think. A mercurial quality is the best thing you can give your kids, the ability to cope with massive change.
Yeah, and that is actually very difficult because you're also, as a parent, your role is to give them security.
I know. I know, yeah. It's a tough one. We've reached the end of this show, so it's time for escape routes. In what cultural oubliettes have our panel locked themselves this week to escape Liz Truss and Russell Brand? Ros, how about you?
Well, I'm sorry about this, and I'm in no way promoting any other podcast, but I have been reading Rory Stewart's book, Politics on the Edge, because it's a very fun read, and it's really shocking, really shocking. There are some MPs there and people who he does not name, but it would not be too difficult to identify, who are the most disgusting specimens of humanity. And then there is one who he does name, David Cameron, and my God, he has no time for David Cameron. David Cameron gets the worst right. And the guy is just absolute. His bullshitting on Afghanistan, his insincerity, it's just, oh dear. But, it is a very good read for all those reasons.
That sounds very exciting. Bring it in next
But don't
week.
Listen to the podcast because the book's better, yeah?
But bring it in next week and I'll borrow it rather than give the buggers
I'm sorry,
sales.
I've got it in my Kindle. Sorry.
All right, okay. Hannah, how about you?
Well, news from the shallow end of culture from me, because this week I've been enjoying the return of Selling the OC, absolute dross on Netflix, following a bunch of ridiculous, semi-scripted, basically real estate brokers in the Orange County. It's nonsense. It's a useful reminder of US extreme wealth and how it basically perverts the whole, the global economy, but that's the only serious thing you can take away from it. The rest of it's just outfits and watching people drinking champagne. It's great. If you want something that's complete nonsense and totally bingeable, please try.
Marvellous. Well, I'm continuing my review of 2000's procedurals series. I did The Mentalist, I did The Closer, and very good they were too. Now I'm doing NCIS, which I had never seen before, and which has gone on for 23 seasons. And I have to say, it is a bin fire. Like, the misogyny, the constant gay panic, like practically every episode has something to do with characters accidentally touching each other or having to be locked in a small space together and panicking because they're men sort of touching each other. It is a complete and utter memento of a time gone by, which is extraordinary considering it is only 20 years old. And Friends is like that as well. Friends, practically every episode has like a gay panic joke or two. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Ros Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah Fearn.
Thank you.
And thanks to me, because I'm worth it. Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon backer, which you should be. Thanks for listening to Oh God, What Now? See you next time.